All right, so let's dive into a topic that might sound a little dry at first glance.
Oh, okay.
International law. But trust me, this one's got some serious real-world drama.
Oh, yeah.
We're talking about a showdown,
Yeah.
in the South China Sea,
Okay.
disputed islands, and a country that basically said, nope, not following the rules.
Interesting. You with me?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating case study, because it really shows what happens when international law kind of bumps up against like raw power politics.
Yeah. It's like the rule of law versus
Exactly.
the reality on the ground.
Yeah.
So picture this, right?
Okay.
The Phectines and China, both claiming these islands, the Paracel and Spratly Islands.
Yeah.
And to make things even spicier, China's been building artificial islands in the area.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
It's a region with a lot at stake, too.
Yeah.
It's not just territory we're talking about, but potentially, valuable resources.
Oh, for sure.
Strategic shipping lanes.
It's like a lot going on.
Big implication.
Yeah.
And that's where the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea,
Right.
or UNCLOS, comes in. It's basically like the rule book for who gets what in the oceans.
Exactly.
It defines things like territorial waters and those resource-rich exclusive economic zones, or EZs.
Right. Think of EZs like underwater territories where a country has, special rights to fish, drill for oil, things like that.
So like underwater territory.
Exactly.
Okay, so the Philippines, armed with UNCLOs, took China to court.
Right.
Specifically, the Permanent Court of Arbitration, or PCA. And here's the kicker. The PCA ruled against China's claims.
This was big. This was a big deal.
Huge.
The PCA basically said that China's 9-dash line,
Okay.
this historical claim they used to justify control over most of the South China Sea, has a no legal basis under UNCLOS.
All on 9-dash line. So they just drew a line on a map and said, all ours.
Well, it's a little more complicated than that.
Right.
But essentially, the PCA found that this vague historical claim doesn't really hold up in modern international law. And here's why that matters. So if it were accepted, it would give China control over these vital resources and shipping routes that other nations depend on.
Oh, wow.
So big implications there.
Yeah, so high stakes indeed. And the PCA didn't stop there.
No, they didn't. They also found that many of the features China calls islands don't actually qualify under UNCLOS.
What?
Yeah, you can't just plop some concrete on a rock and call it an island to get an EEZ.
Oh, so there are rules even for island building.
Exactly. There are rules for everything.
That's fascinating.
And to top it off, the PCA found that China was interfering with the Philippines' right to fish and explore resources within its own EEZ.
Wow.
Which is recognized under international law.
Okay.
They even called out China's island building as a way to try and solidify these claims.
Right.
Which, according to the PCA, doesn't fly.
Okay, so at this point, China's lost the legal battle.
Yeah.
They've been called out for bending the rules. What did they do?
Well,
did they accept the ruling?
That's where things get really interesting. And this is what really highlights the limitations of international law.
Oh.
There's no global police force to enforce these rulings.
So it's like winning a court case.
Yeah.
But the other side just shrugs and says, make me.
Basically, yeah. China simply rejected the PCA ruling, called it null and void.
Oh, wow.
They've continued their island building, even militarized some of those artificial islands.
Really?
And they maintain a very visible naval presence in the region.
So they basically doubled down.
Yeah, they basically said, we're not backing down.
Wow.
This is our territory, and we're going to assert our claims.
Okay, so they're playing hardball.
Absolutely.
This is a high-stakes game.
So what happened next?
Well...
Did the Philippines just back down?
Well...
Did things escalate?
Well, the PCA ruling is legally binding.
Right.
But, as we said, enforcement relies on a country's willingness to comply international pressure and the potential consequences of defiance.
Oh, boy. So this is where things get tricky.
Things get very tricky.
All right, well, we're going to have to leave it there for now.
Right.
But make sure you tune into part 2 of this deep dive, where we'll explore what happened next in this fascinating showdown.
Yeah, it's a real geopolitical thriller.
It really is. Don't miss it. So the Philippines is in this tough spot, right? They have this legal victory, this win.
Yeah.
But China's not playing ball.
Right.
So what did they do?
Well,
Did they just try and rally some international support?
absolutely. The Philippines, armed with that PCA ruling, they went on a diplomatic offensive, trying to get other countries on their side, appealing to countries like the United States, which obviously has a big interest in keeping the South China Sea open for navigation.
Yeah, the U.S. and freedom of navigation. That's a familiar theme.
Right.
They send their warships through those waters pretty regularly.
Exactly.
Kind of like saying, hey, we're watching you.
Right. It's a signal.
Yeah.
The U.S. sees China's actions as a direct challenge to their influence in the region. It's a very complex geopolitical game,
Oh, yeah, for sure.
with each side trying to maintain or expand their power.
So it's not just a two-player game, then.
No, not at all.
You've got other countries watching this unfold,
Absolutely.
wondering who's going to blink first.
Right. You've got countries like Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia.
Right.
They also have claims in the South China Sea.
Yeah,
So they're paying very close attention to how this plays out.
makes sense. So how has China responded to all this international pressure?
Well,
Have they changed their tune at all?
not really. China's consistently rejected that PCA ruling, called it invalid.
Okay.
They've continued their island-building activities. And as I mentioned, they've even militarized some of those artificial islands,
Oh, wow.
basically turning them into military outposts.
So they are not backing down.
Nope.
What's their reasoning for this continued defiance? Like, why are they so insistent?
Well, China sees the South China Sea as strategically vital,
Okay.
both for economic reasons.
Right.
Think about things like fishing rights, potential oil and gas reserves,
Mhm.
and for national security. They view any challenge to their claims in the region as a threat to their sovereignty.
So it's a clash then between China asserting its own interests and the kind of established international order,
Exactly.
which is based on those UNCLOS agreements.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And that tension is what makes this situation so volatile.
Right.
Any misstep, any miscalculation could escalate quickly.
Oh, wow.
That's why this dispute is on the radar of so many countries and international observers.
It sounds like the potential for conflict is very real.
It is.
Have there been any, close calls so far?
There have been some tense moments for sure.
Okay.
Naval standoffs, diplomatic protests.
Right.
But so far, things haven't boiled over into open conflict.
Okay.
But the underlying tensions are definitely still there.
So what are the options here?
Right.
Is there any hope for a peaceful resolution to all of this?
That's the million-dollar question. Some experts believe that dialogue and negotiation are the only way forward, perhaps through a code of conduct for the South China Sea
Okay.
that all the countries involved could agree to.
So setting some ground rules
Exactly.
for everyone to follow.
Right. Others argue that China needs to be held accountable for its actions.
Okay.
And that stronger international pressure, maybe even sanctions, are necessary.
So a combination of incentives and consequences.
You could say that ultimately the outcome of this dispute will have a major impact on the future of the region and the broader global order.
Yeah.
It's a complex web of legal, political, and economic factors.
For sure.
And there are no easy answers.
This deep dive has been really eye-opening.
Yeah.
We've covered the legal battle, the diplomatic maneuvering, the potential for conflict,
Right.
but we haven't really talked much about the people
Yeah.
who actually live and work in the South China Sea.
That's a great point.
They must be caught in the middle of all this.
Absolutely. You're right. It's easy to focus on the big players,
Yeah.
but we can't forget about the human dimension of this dispute.
Right.
Think about the fishing communities who rely on these waters for their livelihoods.
Yeah.
Their lives are directly impacted by this conflict.
It's a good reminder that these geopolitical issues have real-world consequences
Yeah.
for everyday people. It's easy to get caught up, in all this high-stakes geopolitical chess game that's happening in the South China Sea.
Right.
But, we got to remember there are real people who are caught in the middle of all this.
Exactly. It's easy to get lost in all the legal arguments and the diplomatic back and forth. But, at the end of the day, this dispute has a very human cost.
Yeah. Let's talk about those fishing communities we mentioned.
Yeah.
They've relied on these waters for generations.
Mm-hmm.
And now their livelihoods are being threatened by this whole conflict.
Absolutely. I mean, imagine, being a fisherman who's been fishing in these waters your whole life, and suddenly you're facing harassment from, foreign Coast Guard vessels, or you're being denied access to your traditional fishing grounds.
Yeah, that must be so frustrating.
Yeah, and scary.
It's like having your backyard suddenly declared off limits.
Exactly.
What kind of impact is this having on these communities?
Well, the impact is multifaceted. On a practical level, it disrupts their fishing activities, reduces their catch, and threatens their income. I mean, many of these communities depend on fishing for their survival. So the economic consequences can be devastating.
So it's not just an inconvenience.
Mm.
It's like a threat to their way of life.
Exactly. And beyond the economic impact, There's a cultural dimension as well.
Oh, right.
These communities have a deep connection to the sea. It's
Right.
part of their identity, their heritage.
Mm.
And this dispute is disrupting that connection, creating anxiety, uncertainty about the future.
It's a good reminder that these geopolitical disputes aren't just these abstract concepts.
No, they're not.
They have real-world consequences for ordinary people.
They do. And their voices often get lost in the noise of all this, international diplomacy and all the maneuvering and everything.
So how do we make sure their concerns are heard? What can be done to actually support these communities?
Well, there are a few things that can be done. First, we need to raise awareness about the human cost of this dispute.
Okay.
The more people who understand, the challenges these communities are facing, the more likely it is that they'll demand solutions.
So sharing stories, amplifying their voices.
Exactly. Second, we need to support organizations that are working directly with these communities, providing legal aid, economic assistance, and, other forms of support.
And what about on a larger scale?
Right.
Is there any way to address the root causes of this conflict and prevent further harm to these communities?
Well, that's where things get complicated. As we've discussed, resolving the South China Sea dispute is going to require this multifaceted approach, involving diplomacy, negotiation, and a willingness to compromise from all the parties involved.
So there's no quick fix here.
Not at all. It's a long and complex process. But the stakes are high, not just for the countries involved, but for the people who, call the South China Sea region home. Their livelihoods, their cultures, their way of life are at stake.
This deep dive has been incredible.
Yeah, it's a fascinating issue.
We started with this seemingly dry topic, international law, and we uncovered this story that's filled with drama, tension, and real human impact.
It's a reminder that even the most complex global issues have a human dimension, and it's really important to keep that in mind as we try to understand and address these challenges.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the South China Sea dispute. We hope you learned something new and are inspired to keep exploring this fascinating and really important topic. Until next time, stay curious,